Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Riley Center of the Arts here at Burton Academy in Manchester for our candidate forum tonight. My name is Andrew McKeever, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be serving as your moderator tonight for our discussion, which I'm sure you will all find interesting and informative. I'd also like to welcome the television audience that's going to be joining us for tonight's discussion via GNAT-TV. You will also be able to, this is also being recorded for a later rebroadcast, so those of you who don't get enough of political discussion and dialogue tonight can go back for more a little bit later. You'll also be able to watch it on GNAT's website, GNAT-TV.org, if you want to make sure you heard what you thought you heard one of the candidates saying. Anyway, welcome again. Really a pleasure to have you with us. Tonight's forum is being sponsored by the Republican and Democratic committees of Bennington County, as well as my friends at GNAT-TV, and I want to thank, at this time, the organizers from both parties who worked very hard to put on tonight's discussion, and as well as my friends at GNAT who will be filming it. We'll be hearing tonight from three candidates who are running for the two seats in the Bennington 4 district, which includes the towns of Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and most of Sunderland, and as well as Linda Joy Sullivan, who is the sole announced candidate for the Bennington-Rutland 1 district, which includes the towns of Dorset, Danby, Landgrove, Peru, and Mount Tabor. And I can't tell you how hard it is to remember all those 5 towns. Anyway, it'll be my pleasure to introduce them to you all in just a moment, although I'm sure many of them are already quite familiar to you, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here tonight. But first I just want to go over our ground rules and the format for our discussion tonight. Each candidate will get 2 minutes to make an opening statement, and then we'll follow that with a series of questions, which I'll direct to each one of the candidates in turn. The candidate that gets the question asked to them will have 2 minutes to answer the question. The other 3 candidates will get 1 minute each. We'll just go right down the table, and so everyone will have the same amount of time to be the sort of first responder or to be a supplementary answerer. Meanwhile, you folks in the audience are also expected to play a very important part in tonight's event. Several of you have already submitted some questions. That's great. My understanding is there will be file cards available if you decide as we go along that there's another question that pops into your mind. Feel free to write it down. Sometime between the first and second round of questions from the front here, I believe we'll have a short break to collect those questions if there are more of them. So we plan to conclude by around 9 o'clock. We'll do a couple rounds of questions from up here, then go to your questions, and then we'll leave some time at the end for closing statements for the candidates. Without any further ado, let's meet them. Closest to me here is Representative Brian Keefe. He's a Republican who represents the 2-member district, the Bennington 4 district, Arlington, Manchester, Sunderland, and Sandgate. Representative Keefe was born in Vermont, graduated as the valedictorian of his class at Bellows Free Academy in Fairfax, Vermont, and then earned a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics from Loyola University in New Orleans. He served as legislative aide to U.S. Senator Jim Jeffords in Washington, D.C. for 4 years, and then for another 11 years in Vermont. He was Vice President of Government and Public Affairs at the Central Vermont Public Service for another 6 years. His community service here locally includes 12 years on the Manchester Planning Commission, 8 of which he served as the chairman. He's completing his first term in the Vermont legislature, where he serves on the House Human Services Committee. He and his wife, Leslie, also a Vermont native, have lived in Manchester for the last 27 years. They have 2 children, both now young adults. Then we have Representative Cynthia Browning, who has served in the House of Representatives since 2007, and she will be running for re-election to that seat for what would be her 7th term. This past session, she served on the Ways and Means Committee, which has jurisdiction over taxes, fees, and other revenue-related matters. She's a resident of Arlington, and when she's not representing the district up in Montpelier, she also serves on the Arlington Select Board. She is also the executive director of the Battenkill Watershed Alliance, which is an environmental organization dedicated to stewardship of the Battenkill and all of its tributaries. She also holds a PhD in economics and has taught economics at several liberal arts colleges. And as soon as I get my papers in order, we can go and introduce our next two candidates. I got some fairly extensive biographical information here submitted, so I want to make sure I get it all right. Kathleen James is running as a Democrat for one of the two seats in the Bennington 4 district. She is a freelance editor, writer, and nonprofit manager in Manchester, where she has lived since 1996. She's the executive director of the International Skiing History Association, a nonprofit organization that works to preserve the history of skiing worldwide. She edits their journal, Skiing History, while overseeing fundraising, member services, and day-to-day operations. Born and raised in Nebraska, Kathleen earned a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in journalism from Northwestern University. She worked as a Capitol Hill reporter for Roll Call, a reporter-researcher for Time magazine, and a senior editor for Snow Country before settling in Vermont to raise a family. She has since worked as director of admissions at Southern Vermont College, editor-in-chief of Vermont Magazine, and communications director and grant writer at the BOMA Project, a non-governmental organization that helps women to graduate from ultra-poverty in northern Kenya. As a community volunteer, Kathleen has served on the boards of the Zion Preschool, Friends of MEMS, the Manchester School Fund, and Manchester Elementary School, since organizing a bus trip for 110 North Shore residents to the Women's March in Washington in January 2017. She has chaired the Political Impact Committee of Move On Manchester and is current chairwoman of the Manchester Democrats. She's a 2018 graduate of Emerge Vermont, a statewide organization that trains women Democrats to run for office. Kathleen's partner, Alexandra Heinz, is the Chief Patient Safety Officer at Southwestern Vermont Healthcare. Her two daughters, Bailey and Bridget Ring, graduated from Burr and Burton in 2014 and 2017. And last, but hardly least, we have Representative Linda Joy Sullivan, a Democrat who's running in the Bennington-Rutland 1 district of Dorset, Danby, Peru, Mount Tabor, and Landgrove. Linda Joy Sullivan represents the Bennington-Rutland district. She's also a resident of Dorset. She's finishing her first term in office after running for the first time in 2016. Ms. Sullivan is a certified public accountant licensed in Vermont, New York, and Florida, and is a partner in a registered accounting firm. She's also the co-founder of a nonprofit organization that has served over 3,000 victims of human trafficking around the United States. Her bill on human trafficking was signed into law this year by Governor Phil Scott. She is a Vermont State Director of the National Foundation of Women Legislators and was a Justice of the Peace and a member of the Board of Civil Authorities in Dorset prior to running for the House seat. Ms. Sullivan also served on and was chair of the Jurisdiction Committee of the Vermont Council for Children and Family Prevention Programs. She was a court-appointed public member to the Unlicensed Practice of Law Committee of the Florida Supreme Court. She earned her BA in psychology from New School University, an MBA from the New York Institute of Technology, and an LLM degree from the Thomas Jefferson Law School, where she was also awarded a Certificate of Expertise in U.S. Taxation. She currently serves on the House Commerce and Economic Development Committee. Okay, we're about to get started. Two final thoughts. Please turn your cell phones off or set them on stun or whatever it is so that you won't interrupt the flow of discussions about to happen shortly. I'd also appreciate it greatly if you would hold all applause or other verbal gestures of one sort or another until the end of the forum. Our goal here tonight is to have a civil discussion, and we want to hear from all the candidates, get a full range of views of what they think about some of the issues facing our neck of the woods here in northern Bennington County and the state as a whole. So you'll have a chance to register your approval for them all at the end of the meeting, with one exception. Running for public office is a very difficult thing. Many of us don't get to experience what that's like from the inside. It comes at great personal sacrifice and often financial sacrifice, and particularly in these somewhat divided and polarized times, I think it's really fantastic that we have a group of people here tonight who are willing to put themselves forward and offer their service to our district and our state. So why don't we have a round of applause for all the candidates before we begin. Okay, let's get started. First question goes to Brian Keefe.
We're doing the statement.
Oh, right. Of course. I knew I was going to forget this. They want to make opening statements. Brian, you go first.
Well, thanks, Andrew, and thanks, everyone, for being here. We've heard some biographical information. We're about to get into the issues, so I'd like to use this time to tell you a little bit about where I come from. My dad grew up on a relatively prosperous dairy farm in Waterbury, Vermont. In addition to the 80 or so cows they milked by hand, they grew corn and beans and other vegetables that they would truck down to town to the canning factory in Waterbury. And then they would return to the farm with the corn husks and bean shucks to feed to the cows. My dad was first in his family to go to college. My mom grew up on a less prosperous farm in Fairfield, Vermont. She and her 3 siblings were raised by a single mother who had thrown out an abusive alcoholic husband well before I came on the scene. My grandmother had a few beautiful Morgan horses that she would show and breed, along with other farm animals and gardens. My mom attended a one-room schoolhouse in a tiny hamlet of Fairfield, appropriately named St. Rox. I remember seeing her shoot a porcupine out of a tree with a single rifle shot. Porcupines are no friends to horses. I am the third of 8 children. My mom had 6 of us before she turned 25. My dad spent a career as a teacher, principal, and administrator. He had a parallel career in the National Guard and worked a few decades as a basketball referee, among many other things. I attended Bellows Free Academy from 1st grade through 12th. It's one of those schools that don't much exist anymore. In addition to jobs delivering newspapers, throwing bales, and mowing lawns, I played baseball about every day of the summer. It was a wonderful life, though not without its struggles for my parents, even though it took a while for me to recognize those struggles. As I approached graduation, I began to notice how difficult life could be for some, especially those who had been marginalized because of where they lived, the clothes they wore, or how their parents made their living. For my valedictorian address, and against the strenuous warnings of my principal and teachers, I spoke to the plight of these students, those friends. In the receiving line afterwards, my teachers weren't happy with the somewhat naive pontifications of a 17-year-old. But many of the parents told me I had said just what needed to be said. And so I'm glad I said it. So that's a little bit about where I come from.
Cynthia?
I'd like to use this time to tell you why I think I'm a strong candidate for one of the 2 seats in the Bennington 4 district. I'm a strong candidate because I have the expertise, the experience, and the independence to serve this district well in Montpelier. And all of those things are necessary. I have proven all of those things. I have a unique contribution to make since I have a PhD in economics. I can analyze statistics and reports. I can understand material in ways that those who don't have that training can't. I also have been in the legislature long enough to have been assigned to the House Ways and Means Committee, where my understanding of the tax code has been recognized, and I've really pushed for tax reforms that will benefit ordinary Vermonters. I think I've gotten to the point now where I understand some of the systems in our government well enough to be able to think creatively about them. And I think that's really important because some of our systems of government work at cross purposes. On the one hand, the state has put non-education costs into the education fund, which drives up property taxes, but then that makes apartment rentals less affordable because the owners have to pay higher property taxes. So then we have to create programs to support renters so that they can afford their rent, and we create a kind of a vicious cycle. So I think I've gotten to the point where I understand these systems well enough to be able to figure out ways to eliminate those cross purposes, those contradictions, so that state government can work better for Vermonters. And I evaluate all policies that way, whether they are from my party or from another party. I try to analyze the advantages and disadvantages, whether the policies will work, whether there will be unintended consequences, to try to be sure that Vermonters get what they deserve and that there are no false promises or no policies based on slogans. We have to have policies based on reality if they're going to work. I would like to work for a future for Vermont where we have creative sustainability, where the economy and the environment are in some kind of harmony or dynamic balance. And I think the state has a role to play in putting in place the policies that will ensure the investment in people, the investment in the environment, and the investment in creative businesses to make that happen. And that's what I'm working for in the legislature. That's what I will continue to work for if you give me another opportunity to serve you. And I will also note that I have proven my ability to work with people of all different parties, whether they're progressive, Democrat, Republican, or independent. I've done that, and my colleagues come to me to ask for my opinion and consult me about legislation. I think I've risen to the point in knowledge, in understanding, and in position where I can really do a lot for this district. Thank you.
Kathleen James.
I'm Kathleen. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, and I especially want to thank all the people who encouraged me to run, because it gives me a lot of confidence to know that people have confidence in me, and that I'm here tonight representing not just myself, but representing a shared group of values. Like many first-time candidates across the country, I am running in part because of the aftermath of the November 2016 election. As a Democrat, I was disappointed with the outcome, of course, but mostly I was tremendously saddened by the political dialogue in our country, by the incredible level of divisiveness, the polarization, even the hatred. And I felt like it was tearing apart our country, it was tearing apart communities, it was dividing families. And I wanted to take action to try to heal that divide. And I'm also here because of a tremendous moment of hope I felt. After the election, I did lead a big delegate of local residents and women down to the Women's March in Washington, D.C. It was a life-changing experience for me. And as I walked down the streets of Washington, D.C., surrounded by, hundreds of thousands of people, I felt a tremendous sense of hope and optimism and healing. And between November 2016 and the Women's March, I thought there's a conversation going on in our country about who we are and what we want to be and how we want to move forward. And I want to be a part of that conversation. And I decided to run for office, and that's why I'm here. I did grow up in a moderate Republican family, and so I have learned in a very personal way how to respect people of all beliefs, how to listen to other policy positions, how to respect people and take them seriously, and I take that responsibility seriously. And I also believe that policy that's forged from the center is the most enduring, because it doesn't get reversed the minute the administration changes hands. So I think there's both a practical and a passion reason to try to govern from the center. And when it comes to policy, I am not going to pretend to be a policy expert. You will see my color-coded binder. It's a little bit intimidating to be up on the stage with 3 sitting legislators, but what I can promise you is that I'm smart and that I work hard and that I will do my best to understand the issues and to represent everyone in this district. I guess my most motivating value would be fairness. I believe in equal access, and it underscores almost everything you'll hear me talk about tonight. I believe that every Vermonter, every family, every working person, everyone who lives in this state deserves equal access to all the opportunities that we all share. I'm talking about housing, I'm talking about education, I'm talking about health care, I'm talking about the ability to have a job that can support a family. And that motivates me. And that's why I'm here tonight as well. I feel like we've reached a time in our nation's history when we're really being challenged to think about what we believe in and to stand up for that. And thanks for having me.
Okay, Linda Joy Sullivan.
thank you for coming and thank you for letting me participate. As you've heard, I do not have any opposition, so I'm going to try to limit as much as I can so that the candidates who have a live race can actually go forward and let you hear what they have to say, which I believe is very important. I actually would like to tell you at the beginning and at the end of this forum what I believe a legislator should do for their district. I think that we will have a lot of time this evening to go over individual issues, and so I'd like to focus on that for a short period of time. I personally never run from difficult decisions, and I willingly contribute ideas and solutions across party lines. Second, I do not pander to voters, and I don't follow mandates that a party dictates or special interests, no matter how friendly I am with them. As my constituents will tell you, and as evidenced by support of my candidacy from voters of both major parties, I tell it like it is. I'm always willing to face the music. For me, that's what leadership is all about. And third, I listen. And more importantly, I do not fear compromise. I do not shun. I do not bully. I'm not a puppet. And I feel that I approach my role for the Bennington-Rutland District with a thoughtful and analytical approach. I have been called upon by other committees in the House as a liaison to actually help them with language that's appropriate in the bills. And that tells me that they appreciate my analytical training and they appreciate my detail to words and my legal and financial understanding. So I take that as being valued and respected by the House of Representatives. That's what I can offer to the community, and I'm very thankful for my voters' continued support.
Okay, thank you all for those comments and statements. So, now let's get to the questions. Brian, you go first. By dint of sitting on the side of the table closest to me. Vermont in general, and southern Vermont in particular, have a growing demographics problem. The population as a whole is getting older, and attracting younger residents to move here or stay here has been a frequent topic of discussion. Many hotels, restaurants, and other businesses are having a hard time finding workers. If re-elected, what would be your plan or favorite approach to encourage a new, fresh workforce to move here or stay here in the case of younger Vermonters who may think of moving away after finishing their formal education?
Well, thanks, Andrew. I think the first thing we have to do is help make Vermont a more affordable place for people to live and raise their families and work here. And when I ran 2 years ago, that was the main theme. We had just gone through 6 years of raising taxes and raising spending, and people were frustrated with that sense that it was never going to end. And with a more balanced government, we put a halt to that. And for 2 years, we haven't raised taxes noticeably, and we've kept spending to 2%. So fundamentally, that's at the base. Beyond that, we need to focus more on job training partnerships with our businesses. Vermont has a good job training partnership program through the Department of Commerce. We need to focus on that. We need to encourage our young people to look at some of the options in the trades and vocational areas where we're very strong at Mount Anthony High School. Some of the programs here in Burr and Burton and at Arlington in conjunction with Mac Molding provide some opportunities for apprenticeships and growth. And one of the bills that I introduced this year had to do with promoting the ITV Festival, which is about to happen in 2 weeks here in Manchester after a great successful year last year. The Burr and Burton students and others are involved in that to a high degree, and that targets this demographic directly to help that creative economy, the low impact to our environment, and try to encourage people to live and stay and work here.
Okay, thank you, Representative Keefe. I should have mentioned before we got started that none of the candidates have seen these questions. They are going to be, you all are going to be finding out at the same time as they do what the question is going to be. So each one of the other three candidates will get 1 minute to supplement that answer from Representative Keefe. So Representative Browning, your
Thank
turn.
you. I certainly think that Brian covered a lot of the important points points. I think that training is essential, and we have done a lot to try to work with Vermont Technical College and manufacturers to make more training available to young Vermonters. I also think affordable housing is important, and although we have now, we're going to be issuing bonds to invest in more affordable housing, I think we need to have more aggressive programs for renovating and reusing spaces that are not being used, whether it's retail that's no longer needed, or schools that have closed, or other sorts of institutions. And although that's mostly a private endeavor, there may be ways for the state to help that. I also think the state has to continue to invest and to require private companies to invest in upgrading telecommunications. We know this is a wired world. We have to have that ability everywhere in Vermont. You have to be able to run a business from Sandgate or from Sunderland or from Dorset, from anywhere. You have to be able to do your homework from those places. I also would just like to mention something that we discussed a lot last session, which was a new baby leave, new baby payment. There are about 6,000 new babies in Vermont every year, some of them adopted, some of them, most of them born here. Would there be a way for us to finance paternal and maternal leave for new babies? This was sort of folded into some of the paid family leave things, and then it got separated. The question is always, how do you finance it? I was trying to figure out a way to finance it with the uncollected bottle deposits, but that was a little too creative, and then they used those for something else. But I think that being family friendly, there may be some kind of way that there could be a stipend, a one-time amount that new parents get. And I think that would go some distance to showing that Vermont wants families, needs families, and needs children, and needs them here in Vermont, needs new Vermonters. Again, my proposal is not fully developed, but I think it shows that there may be things we can do beyond what we've already thought of.
Thank you, Representative Browning. Kathleen.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. This is an interesting question. There were a couple of small programs launched this year to try to attract people to come to Vermont. There was a plan to offer, I think, $10,000 to telecommuters who would move here. And there was a sort of a pilot program to invite people to come and stay for the weekend, and maybe they would like Vermont and stay. And, those programs are fine as far as they go, but I think it's really important to take a holistic look at who's leaving and why. And if you look at the stats, highly educated people are leaving Vermont, and recent college grads are leaving because they can find higher paying jobs and cheaper housing elsewhere. So I think it's important that Vermont think in a big way about benefits that could attract dual income and working families like that to stay. So paid family leave, I think, would be a reason that a family would stay in Vermont. It certainly would have been appealing to me. Universal primary care, I think, would be tremendously attractive to people. And for low and moderate income Vermonters, we can talk about those benefits, plus a focus, as Cynthia said, on affordable housing and affordable childcare. So instead of sort of quick hit programs that try to get one or two people to move here, by bringing them for a weekend, let's look at getting a system in place that makes it really attractive for people to move here and stay here, because we offer benefits that help families. I also totally agree with what Brian said about the creative economy, but I see a much larger opportunity in the climate economy. I think Vermont should be getting out in front of the nation in terms of climate action and establishing a really vibrant climate economy. These are jobs all over the spectrum. It's everything from retrofitting houses, those are good paying construction and trade jobs, to tech startups. We should be offering incentives for climate tech entrepreneurs to move here. So I'd like to see us really putting the climate economy as sort of the framework that we view Vermont from. And if you've got a cutting edge climate economy, a vision of Vermont as the state that leads the nation in climate action, and then benefits that really help working families stay here, I think that's a powerful package. I'd stay.
Thank you, Kathleen. Representative Sullivan.
Actually, I always think about, as a legislator, how we can best advance the economic opportunity for all and how we can help the individual Vermonters. I do believe that we need to grow jobs. However, I do not believe that it's just numbers that we need to focus on. I think we need to focus on the jobs for our youth, but the jobs that the youth actually want. So when we're working with the educators and we're working with the career pathways, we also need to focus on what careers these young people would like to get into. I also believe that we need to increase our commercial tax base. I think that the burden of financing the entire state rests too heavily on our relatively small number of individual wage earners, and I know that the homeowners in the state need some relief. I think we need to attract businesses and we need to actually encourage growth. I know that there are some in Montpelier who think that we can't have both, that it's a binary approach. We can either have business or keep Vermont the way we like it. I think it is imperative that we put it together. I do believe that we can have both.
Thank you, Representative Sullivan. Okay, we'll go to our next round of questions, which will start with Representative Browning, and then on to Kathleen James and Linda Joy, then back to Brian. And I'll just gently remind our candidates that 2 minutes for the first responder and 1 minute or so for all the rest of you. I don't want to be like nasty about it, but that would probably be a good idea because my little stopwatch here doesn't lie. Okay, Representative Browning. The number of students attending public schools in Vermont is significantly lower today than it was 20 to 30 years ago, yet the total amount of state money spent on education remains at a relatively high level. We spend roughly about $18,000 per student, which puts Vermont in the top 5, among the top 5 states in the nation for per pupil spending. Would you support going to an income tax-based system instead of one that relies as heavily as our present one does on the property tax? If not, then what changes would you like to see to the way Vermont finances public education, if any?
2 minutes, huh?
I realize these are complicated questions.
All right, well, you're going to have to start waving or something. This is a really important topic. The cost of education have certainly been rising quickly, driven to a significant extent by special education, and remember, that's mandated by the federal government, although we are trying to reform the way we deliver it. So the cost of education have been rising faster than the growth in the economy, but that isn't the only problem in the education fund. The state of Vermont, since we created the education fund with Act 60, the state of Vermont has put non-education policy costs in the education fund. So that means that property taxes have to cover those costs in addition to education. And most of those programs are things like current use, which support agriculture and forestry, or property tax assistance, which supports home ownership. I support those policy goals, but they are not actually education. So before there was an education fund, those costs were in the general fund. They should not be on the education property tax. That is supposed to be for pre-K through 12. So I think that's the most important thing. Although we have a problem with our per pupil cost of education, one of the problems is this vicious cycle of increases in property taxes, increases in subsidy costs that cause increases in property taxes. So we need to reform that. I am open to all different proposals for that reform. I, in fact, voted for different versions of shifting more of a burden onto the income tax this past session. What I supported, which was not perfect, did not ultimately pass, so that task remains. But just shifting some of the costs from the property tax to the income tax without dealing with the profound distortion and I think actual dishonesty of funding non-education policies with education property taxes is not going to solve the problem. So this is an example where I understand that system well enough to be able to analyze it and think about how can we get those costs out of there without causing disruption. How can we shift costs onto the income tax that used to be on the property tax, but we may be able to do it by taking costs out of the ed fund, not by putting more income taxes into the ed fund. So that's the direction that I will be working on, and in fact, I'm working on it right now. I'm working on proposals right now to figure out how to do that more effectively.
Thank you, Representative Browning. Kathleen James.
Thanks. Cynthia has expertise here that I'm not going to try to match, and I probably went long on my last answer, so I'll keep this one short. I will say that I always come back to fairness. My gut tells me, and from the reading I've done, I think that some balance of income and property taxes, some proportion there, best reflects a family's ability to pay. So I think the question was, would you shift toward an income tax entirely? No, I would not. I do also want to say one quick thing, and this is about the fact that, that Vermont spends a lot on its schools, and I know that we do, but I also think that that brings results. I don't think it's fair when I hear people say that we spend a lot on our schools and we don't get good outcomes. I don't agree with that. We're sitting here at Burton, for starters, which is an outstanding school. And in 2018, I just wanted to note that we were ranked 3rd by Education Week, 4th by U.S. News and World Report, and 3rd by USA Today for the excellence of our schools. That brings families here. That's an economic driver, and it's something we should be proud of. That is an investment.
Thank you, Kathleen. Representative Sullivan.
I think that this is an extremely complex question, and I think that it's very important for us to understand that when you have good schools, people are willing to pay more in taxes for that environment. However, I do believe that we have to have a balance because we are too tax heavy right now for the people in Vermont, but we do have a good education system. I think that to say we could shift from property tax to income tax is just too cut and dry, and that's just not an accurate answer. I think that you have to look at the tax code and we have to drill down. We have to look at local schools. We have to actually look at how many students are in each school. So I think that it's very important to work with the local regions as well. So to answer that in a quick, what should we do and how should we finance? I think it's been going on for many years in the House. So I think the idea right now is we want good education. We want people to stay here, but we do want to see how many students are in each school and how we can best give them the education and keep people here.
Representative Keefe.
Well, we have an income sensitivity program by which about 70%, I believe, of Vermonters currently pay their education property tax through their income. And those that are not eligible, those that are past a certain income level, pay it on their property. I think that's a good program. I think we have to be careful as we change the breakpoints in that program. We had some reforms this year in special education. The Act 46 reforms are kicking in and have some hope for savings. But meanwhile, as Cynthia said, we keep throwing non-education policy costs into the education fund, which is not a good thing. And at the end of the session last year, we ended up raising, I've said earlier, we didn't raise taxes hardly at all, while the one place we did raise taxes was on rental properties and business properties and other non-residential property, non-homestead property. And I think that was a mistake. I think it was unnecessary. We had a big growth in income year over year, and the basic problem with the high cost of the high taxes is high spending. And we need to, yes, we need to support our schools. They are a draw to families, but we need to control those costs better.
Thank you. Okay, third question. We'll start with Kathleen James here. One of the proposals that surfaced last year in the legislature was a carbon tax plan known as the Essex Plan. That plan aims to make fossil fuels more expensive while cutting the cost of electricity. If elected, would you support a carbon tax or carbon pricing plan, as it's sometimes called?
That's a tough one. It's not one I've made up my mind about yet. Although I have read the Essex Plan and done some reading on carbon tax. I know it's very controversial. You know, it's interesting to see that a group of conservative politicians recently came out in support of a carbon tax led by George Shultz and Trent Lott, which was very surprising to me. My concern about a carbon tax is that if it's not very carefully implemented, it could be regressive. And so I worry about unintended consequences. I think the carbon tax has a worthy goal, and I think it's worked in some other countries and been very effective there. But I would be very reluctant to vote for a tax that could hurt working families, that could hurt low-income families, that could hurt rural people who have to commute long distances to work. So I'm not trying to waffle. I truly have not made up my mind. I think in the end, maybe a carbon tax would be something that would be best enacted at the national level, so that it wouldn't put Vermont, say, at a competitive disadvantage to New York or New Hampshire or Mass. So I'm not trying to waffle. I think that's a really tough one. I don't know how I would vote.
Okay. Representative Sullivan.
So I have been, as an incumbent, approached by a leadership so far up in Montpelier to say that it is going to be one of the bills that are up there as a carbon tax. I will say that I am going to agree with Kathleen James's position that a carbon tax will contribute to a national strategy to affect carbon pricing, and I am not convinced that that is the right choice for Vermont. Here in Vermont, it will be regressive. It will absolutely be felt the hardest in rural areas where we have absolutely no effective transportation alternatives and where we don't have cost-effective retrofit technologies available to address home heating issues. I believe the so-called Essex Plan actually requires that the tax collection be accompanied by tax rebates, and that makes it less than an imperfect plan. As a member of the State Legislators United for Climate Action, with over 50 of my colleagues in Montpelier, we made a commitment across the country to say that we will work with the governors, whichever governor is in place, to make sure that we figure out a way to come up with a good plan. So I intend to go to Montpelier next year, prepared to roll up my sleeves and figure out what works for Vermont. So right now, I think that we should use caution when dealing with a carbon tax.
Thank you, Representative Sullivan. Representative Keefe.
Well, I think we in Vermont should be proud of the taxes we currently pay to support renewable energy and non-carbon solutions. We pay a lot on our electricity bills, we pay a lot on our gas bills, we pay a lot on our fuel oil bills. But to implement a carbon tax and go even further, I'm against that. I won't waffle or equivocate on that. I'm against a carbon tax for a lot of the reasons that have been stated. It's regressive and it puts us at a regional disadvantage. And for people there, but as Linda Joy said, we have an Essex plan up there. This will be a big push. This will be a big issue next year and the year after and the year after. And because a lot of people want the carbon economy to be the framework for Vermont. They want Vermont to be a cutting edge on this issue. They want us to lead the nation on this issue. And if you're going to do that, you need to raise some money, and that's the carbon tax. So it's a big issue. I'm against the carbon tax.
Okay, Representative Browning.
Thank you. Well, I think that the other candidates have covered a lot of the territory I would have covered. I will just say that I fully support the goal of reducing the use of fossil fuels, reducing climate change generating pollution. But I think the question is, how can we design policies that will actually work to achieve that goal without hurting low-income Vermonters and ordinary small Vermont businesses? And this, again, is where the question of how taxes are designed, are they based on reality? Are they based on an understanding about how the tax burden shifts around? And even if we design rebates, are the rebates easy to get? The income sensitivity program, the renter rebate program, those are complex programs and they are hard to take advantage of. So we really need to be very careful about this. I personally would like to be looking at eliminating some of the ways in which the tax code currently subsidizes subsidizes the use of fossil fuels, because businesses and individuals can deduct the cost of using some of them. Sometimes they are exempt from sales tax. So if you impose a carbon tax, but people can just deduct its cost, you're not going to change their behavior. So I'm open to this consideration. I think regional or national is better. I also think that any tax should be accompanied by reducing some other tax. And I think that we might want to be able to think about flexible taxation. So when fossil fuel prices are high, there is no tax. And when they are low, there's a tax. Because one thing that's a problem with this is that fuel prices are very volatile, and when they're high, people conserve and they invest in renewables. When they're low, people buy gas-guzzling cars and don't worry about their wood stoves. So we might be able to give people a way to have better signals without imposing an undue burden. But that's just an idea. That's not a fully fledged proposal. But we need to be very careful how we do this to be sure it actually changes the consumption of fossil fuels and that it does not impose an undue burden on certain groups of Vermonters.
Thank you, Representative Browning. Okay, last question of this series goes to Representative Sullivan. The opioid issue has been one that's plagued Vermont, as it has many other states, going back well over a decade or more now. Is there something more the state should be doing to expand treatment for those seeking to break free of opioid addiction? And specifically, what more should be done here in Bennington County to enhance treatment options?
So when we approach the opioid crisis, I believe it's crucial to focus on preventing excessive opiate prescriptions. However, when we do that, it's also important that we do not limit a doctor's ability to make a decision on how to care for a patient. We need to be careful that when we come up with new ideas or new plans, that we do not set a new standard of care, forcing a doctor to take that standard of care that interferes with the person or the patient that is actually in acute pain and needs this opiate if it's so prescribed. What we do need to do, however, is encourage industry collaborative efforts. We need doctors, hospitals, facilities, practice groups, and even accountable care organizations to participate. And I really believe that locally in Bennington, as well as in the state of Vermont, that we need to take the regulations that are out there, the guidelines that are already in place, and we need to put them into statute. We need to have more accountability. We do not need to change the regulations, but we need to have people held accountable for the repeat offenders who are writing the prescriptions, not for the doctors who are prescribing. The problem that we have here is that the doctors have now been forced to become the first responders for the pharmaceutical companies. And while they are doing their jobs, the pharmaceutical companies are telling them that opiates are the way to go. And that has become part of the big business. So I think we have to watch out for overprescription, and we need to take care. I think if we don't go directly to the cause, we will not be able to cure this. I believe we do need all the programs that are already in place. You don't want to judge them, but I do think that we need to definitely say guidelines need to become statute.
Thank you, Representative Sullivan. Representative Keefe.
Well, this is one of the biggest challenges of our time. It's growing. Other states are facing it as well, but it's a growing problem, not a shrinking problem. So we need to build capacity to deal with it. Targeting the youth with education programs is key. Similar to when we turn the tide on drunken driving and tobacco use, we need to explain to people and teach people and build it in that this is a bad way to go. The treatment programs, we need to have better treatment programs so we can meet the individuals when they're ready to be met. In Bennington, there's a lot of partnerships going on with the United Counseling Service, the hospital, Turning Point Recovery Center, but they need more help. Right now, we have this hub and spoke system around the state. Bennington's a spoke, it needs to be a hub. We we need to support our emergency response people, our police, our fire and rescue, who are often at the front lines of this, and we need to support them. And enforcement is also key. I'm in favor of harsh punishment for people who deal this stuff. So yeah, we can do a lot more in Bennington County, and we need to.
Representative Browning.
Thank you. Yes, I think the other candidates have again done a good job of covering many of the points I would have made. I will just say that one size doesn't always fit everyone in terms of treatment. We need to make sure we have medication-assisted treatment, abstinence-based treatment, inpatient, outpatient. We need to have a variety of treatments available. And I think that in many cases it needs to be linked to mental health treatment, because sometimes people use opioids. Certainly sometimes they begin in terms of physical and injury or pain, but sometimes they're self-medicating for an underlying emotional disturbance. So we need to be sure that our mental health system is ramped up to deal with these co-occurring disorders, and we need to be sure that treatment is also available in corrections, because again, people end up in corrections when they get in trouble, often because of substance abuse and mental health issues. So we need to try to be sure that all Bennington residents can get access to treatment when they need it. I've heard of programs in other states where if someone comes to an ER in withdrawal, the ER doctor can be authorized to provide the drug of treatment, the methadone or Suboxone, right there and get them into treatment right there. This is not when someone's in an overdose, it's when they're in withdrawal. And I'm not sure how that works in the Bennington Hospital, but I think that is an interesting possibility, because as Representative Keefe said, you want to take advantage of when people are in a situation where they are open to trying to solve this problem. And remember, we all have to work on this together. We all know people who have struggled with this, and it's definitely a community-wide problem. I will also say that, and again, here's my House Ways and Means hat, we did discuss the possibility of trying to impose a tax on opiate manufacturers, but it's difficult to figure out a way, because we would use that revenue to pay for the treatment that their drugs are in part contributing to, but it's difficult to figure out a way to do that without making insurance or healthcare costs go up, so we actually did not move forward with that proposal. But that's also something to think about to fund the efforts that people have talked about.
Okay. Kathleen James.
Yeah, this is a real passion issue for me. As Cynthia said, this is an issue that strikes very close to home for many of us. And because I'm a journalist, I reached out, I did some reporting, and I reached out to Brenda Siegel. She ran for governor on the Democratic ticket, and I called her because she had, I thought, a really compelling 4-point plan for opioid, to address the opioid crisis that was really thought out. And she has since, even though she didn't win the nomination, she's taking that plan forward. Attorney General T.J. Donovan has endorsed it. Christina Hallquist has endorsed it. And I think she's got some great ideas. She focuses primarily and first and foremost on harm reduction. And she uses as an example the Safe Recovery Center up in Burlington, which serves most of Chittenden County. And that's a place where people can go to get unlimited use of Narcan. They can, there's a clean needle exchange, and most importantly, there are nurses and social workers on staff. So you're saving lives, and with any luck, you're getting people information about treatment and helping refer them out. She has an idea that you could put those harm reduction units into vans as well, and put mobile harm reduction units in our rural communities and our rural regions, and I think it's a fantastic idea. She also obviously focuses on medically assisted treatment on demand. If you come in asking for it, you get it. Dual diagnosis support, very important, and criminal justice reform. I think it's really, really important to focus on a drug court or diversion program that can help people find their way into recovery. Because, recovery is not just substituting Suboxone for heroin. Recovery is a 360-degree process. And if you want to move somebody out of addiction into a lifetime of recovery, you need a 360-degree support network that can help them not only get the mental health treatment that they need, but find a recovery community. A lot of people need job training and job skills, financial literacy training. So I think we need to be thinking about this in a 360-degree way, and I liked Brenda Siegel's plan.
Okay, well, that completes round one of questions for our panel here. We have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, so we'll want to get to those as soon as we can. But we'll go a second round of questions here, and we'll start with Representative Browning on this one. Earlier this year, possession of small amounts of marijuana became legal in Vermont, the 9th state to do so. Would you support moving on to a tax and regulate system, similar to the one in place in Colorado on marijuana? This would be a system, and I'm sure you know this better than I, where the state would allow licensed vendors to sell the product and collect sales taxes in return.
Thank you. Yes, this topic has been under discussion in the legislature for a long time. Up until this point in time, I have not seen a proposal for taxing and regulating marijuana that protects the safety of the traveling public by having sufficient highway patrol officers who are trained in drug recognition, have a way of identifying intoxication from marijuana, and that prevent use of marijuana by our young people, because no one thinks that's a good idea. It can have mental and physical effects on their growth. So I've also been concerned about the attitude of the federal government. The federal government still classifies marijuana at the same level as heroin, which is absurd, and we all know that. I don't know that there's going to be any change in that in the near future, but apparently the feds are tolerating what's happening in other states, and I think Vermont is going to be surrounded by states and provinces that have tax and regulate marijuana. So I'm willing to consider going there, but it has to have sufficient highway safety. It has to have sufficient money for prevention and education, and I think it has to have tight regulations so that not just anyone can be growing and selling it. It has to require licensing. We have to have control on advertising. The last thing I want to do is to have the tobacco industry control the marijuana industry in Vermont. I also think it's important for people to understand that when you tax marijuana, you can't have the tax too high, otherwise it may mean that people still go to the black market because the legal price is too high. So you're going to get some tax revenue, but a lot of that tax revenue is going to be needed to cover the necessary regulations to keep Vermonters safe. So I think it's important not to be seen that this is some sort of golden goose of all this new tax revenue that we can use for all these other things. Yes, we will have revenue. We can use it for education and for highway safety, but we won't necessarily have a lot of new revenue for you to use for all kinds of things or be able to reduce other taxes. So I'm open to a new proposal, but I have always said you have to protect the safety of the traveling public, you have to protect young people, and you have to tightly control the growth, marketing, and selling of this substance.
Thank you, Representative Browning. Kathleen James.
Yeah, I must say I agree with Cynthia on a lot of her points. I would absolutely institute a tax and regulate market for marijuana, not just for the tax revenues, which may not be as much as we had originally hoped, but also for safety, so that people are not buying unregulated, dangerous drugs on the street. So I think it provides double benefits. Agree about roadside testing for sure, and about youth education and prevention. One thing that I've been surprised to see, but it's encouraging because I think legalization or tax and retail is the direction we should head in, is that youth Marijuana use rates in Colorado have dropped since marijuana was legalized there. I was surprised to see that. It was an extensive Washington Post article that I read and bookmarked to go back to and check some of the original sources. But youth marijuana use in Colorado right now is at its lowest rate in 10 years, and its rate is lower than in Vermont. So I don't think it's true that that legalization or a tax and regulate market is going to necessarily lead to some big uptick in youth use, because as Cynthia says, none of us want that. I guess I just come from a place of feeling that prohibition never works, and Canada has gone fully legal. They've got a tax and regulate market. It's where the country's heading. I think we need to do it wisely and do it smart so that we can keep people safe, make sure they know what they're getting, and reap some taxes in the meantime.
Thank you, Kathleen. Representative Sullivan.
So I believe there does need to be a safe place for eligible adults to smoke marijuana. However, I believe that unlike alcohol, marijuana is still illegal. I am working on a bill with a fellow legislator right now that we will be presenting. I'm more focused on the club, marijuana club and membership, and controlling it through appropriate business regulation. I'm not comfortable with the Colorado structure that's out there right now. I think public safety issues and what's actually put into marijuana so far, how it may be laced, is something we need to pay attention to. So I'm highly concerned about those outside effects. I do know that Washington, D.C. came out with a task force that identified what would work and what wouldn't work. And so my fellow colleague in the legislature and I have been analyzing that and working with Leg Council. So we will be bringing forward a proposal on a tax and regulate.
Thank you, Representative Sullivan. Representative Keefe.
Well, on the serving on the House Human Services Committee, we deal with the medical marijuana for symptom relief, and we've expanded access to those programs over the past couple of years. I think that's a good thing. And now it's legal, of course, for adults to possess and consume marijuana, and they can buy it from a regulated place outside of the state. I think the jury is still out on the impacts in other states that have gone to the tax and regulate. And I'm not convinced that the new revenue really represents the proverbial pot of gold that a lot of people think. And I think I've been hearing over the past couple of years the optimism for big money for the state out of the tax and regulate is going, the optimism is waning on that. So I'd be happy to just stay with the current system we have for a little while and just see how it plays out in other states. I don't think we need to rush to go into a whole new program.
Thank you, Representative Keefe. Okay, Kathleen, let's get local. A few weeks ago, a local group of environmental activists came before the Manchester Select Board and advocated for a town-wide ban on the use of plastic bags. The Select Board encouraged them to focus on bringing pressure on the state legislature to pass a statewide ban on plastic bags. So, if elected, would you support such a statewide ban on the use of small plastic shopping bags?
This isn't an issue I've done a ton of research on, and I am a cautious person, and I don't like to make promises or get out ahead of myself when I haven't really done my homework. So obviously I'm very well aware of Earth Matters. I've done a lot of work with them. They're my friends in many ways, and so I was aware that they were bringing this to the town council, and I actually thought it was a really interesting response that this might be something best, looked at as a state level. I didn't have an adverse reaction to that at all. My gut tells me that it would be something that I would be inclined to support, but I would want to make sure that any legislation we passed had some flexibility built in or some sensitivity built in, especially to small businesses. I would want to make sure that we were, I guess, accomplishing a greater environmental good while making sure that we weren't placing an undue burden on businesses that couldn't afford it, or that we at least offered them some kind of flexible option. So, maybe there's a tier of businesses that could somehow be exempt. I'm just talking off the top of my head. And now I'm done. Talking off the top of my head.
All right. Representative Sullivan.
So I think that they should try it locally first. I think that they should see how it works. I think it may be too difficult for older Vermonters to deal with. I think that it may be too difficult for small business to get established right away into this plastic bag changeover. I know that people have been seeing on social media the repercussions of what happens with plastic, but I think that right now that should stay locally. To say I would support it or wouldn't support it is far too premature. I have to look at the details of the bill and exactly what they're asking us to do. So I personally would think that it should stay locally, they should try it, and we should see what happens.
Representative Keefe.
Well, I'm going to disagree with my friend from Dorset on that one because I think it is a legislative issue, a state issue. I think it's probably time to look at our whole waste management systems. We have some crazy balkanized ways we deal with different products, and it sends trucks going here and trucks going there, and people deal with their waste in different ways. Visitors sometimes treat trash differently than locals do. We've just got a lot of different systems. And when you talk about plastic bags, then you're talking about plastic straws, and then you're talking about, well, what good is plastic? And I just think there's a lot behind this discussion. It should be at the statewide level. That's where the capacity is to deal with it. And I just think that's where it belongs.
Okay. Representative Browning.
Thank you. I think this is an issue very much worth exploring at the state level. I couldn't commit to a ban there or locally at this time, but I think the consequences of plastic pollution for the environment, for our waterways, for the oceans, for wildlife are becoming more and more clear. I think we definitely need to reduce, reuse, and recycle. I brought my own reusable container. This is recyclable, but there's no deposit on it, so many of them don't get recycled. Many plastic bags end up with the recycling where they contaminate it and make it impossible to recycle materials. So I would like to see movement towards biodegradable plastics. I know one store that really cares about this issue, and they have voluntarily begun using biodegradable plastic material. So it's actually not plastic, it's made out of cornstarch or some other material. I think there are ways to solve this problem, whether it's with straws or bags, but we need to take responsibility for what we're doing, our own actions, ask stores to give us substitutes, bring reusable containers, because the plastic just is an incredible invention, but it should be kept for things that really need to be as durable as plastic is, not for ephemeral, throwaway materials that just end up in the environment and just mean that we threw away fossil fuel resources, since plastic is made out of fossil fuels. That doesn't make sense. So I think that we need to take responsibility for our behavior. We need to look at alternatives and substitutes, and I think the state legislature has a role to play in that, but we should be very careful about putting mandates on people that may impose undue burdens.
Okay, next question goes to Representative Sullivan. This sort of follows up on the first question that I began the discussion with tonight. One of the ideas I've heard mentioned in recent weeks is that given the shortages of the number of volunteers in fire departments and rescue squads, one of the possible ways of attracting more volunteers into both organizations would be to offer some sort of tax break to people who would be willing to volunteer for, volunteer fire department or rescue squad. This could be a property tax break, it could be an income tax break or something. I guess, what is your feeling about that? Do you think that's a good idea and might actually work to bring more people into those services, or would that just be a non-starter?
I don't think it would be a non-starter. I think that volunteers already are allowed to take X amount of hours, and they get that as part of their deduction. I think that the lack of sophisticated tax preparers to tell them what they're entitled to is a problem. I do think that tax incentives, though, for volunteers would be a good idea. I think better would be championing with some local colleges and giving credit to students who are approaching graduation to see if they can't get credit and hours to come into these areas and start to work with these volunteer positions. But I do think that we need to find an incentive, because we are volunteers and we rely on them. They're first responders. They keep us safe. So we have to give them something, perhaps some type of structure like an earned income tax credit might work, but we have to really research it.
Okay, Representative Keefe.
Well, Governor Phil Scott was here a month or so ago swarming the county and with a lot of his cabinet members, and one of the sessions I attended was at the Manchester Firehouse, and there were various fire departments there, mainly Manchester, Arlington, but also there were folks there from Bennington. And this is a big problem demographically. There's just a declining workforce. There's younger people are less and less inclined to get involved in this, and a lot of the people that are part of it now, they started when they're teens or 20s. So it's culturally we're moving away, and as Linda just said, it's a huge priority. I was heartened to see that at Manny Anthony they've started a training program at the high school for emergency response, and I think that's great. As far as tax breaks for volunteers in the emergency services, yes, I'm in favor of that. I'm not exactly sure where we would find the money and what the mechanisms would be, but I'm sure it can be done and it should be done.
Representative Browning.
Thank you. Yes, I think this is a really important issue. I serve on the Arlington Select Board, and we have oversight of the Arlington Fire Department, and we face this problem and in our effort to support our fire department and the fire company. I think that we should be very careful about offering tax breaks, because as Representative Keefe just said, if you reduce this person's taxes, somebody else's taxes are going to have to rise in order to have the same level of tax revenue. And so you really want to understand the consequences of what you're doing. I think better access, easier, cheaper training is important. I think that I would rather look at systems of health insurance. Would there be a way to provide volunteer firefighters or rescue squad members access to systems of health insurance that are from the state or from the Vermont League of Cities and Towns or some other sort of health insurance program? Now, this again might cost towns something, so that would mean it would essentially be on your property tax. But if it was a way to provide access to an existing system, an existing pool, the cost might be spread so wide that the increase in cost would be insignificant. So I think we need to be careful about tax breaks. We have a real problem, but just as with all policies, we want to make sure we don't do something that would have unintended consequences. And I like going to health insurance, which might be not just for the firefighter, but also for their families.
Thank you, Representative Browning. Kathleen James.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in exploring a tax break, or Cynthia, I think, has an interesting idea, to provide something that rewards the people who serve our communities as volunteers. Like Brian, I also saw that Bennington had started a paid apprenticeship program for its EMTs. I thought that was really encouraging. And I think just in terms of tech ed, it's such an important issue for our state. I think we need to do whatever we can to make sure that we are connecting high school kids with programs that can provide them with training in these careers. Thanks.
Okay. The next question will go to Brian Keefe. Brian, you mentioned the governor's appearance here recently from Bennington County became a capital for today, and at one of the luncheons the governor was at, he was asked a question by one of our local prominent businesswomen, who shall remain nameless for the moment unless you read the paper. She asked the governor why the state only invests roughly $3 million in tourism advertising. when the tourist industry in Vermont is one of the largest in the state and yields, I believe the number was close to $200 million in revenue in one form or another. The question is, do you think the state should be putting more money into tourist advertising and promotion? And if so, where would this money come from?
I think we should spend more money on tourism promotion because we get a great return on it. I don't know where it would come from, but I think we could find a way. So I think it's a good idea. I think we get a return on that. We've had other opportunities too. We had the Vermont Life magazine that lay dormant for a couple years, and this past year there was a RFP out to try to find people that would resuscitate it. You take it over with the existing staff, take it over with the new staff, buy it outright, do a fee for service. There were a bunch of proposals that came in, and at the end of the day they just let it go. The state decided to reject all the offers and let it lay dormant, and that brand, that Vermont Life brand, is just sitting in a closet somewhere. You know, I didn't read the bids or anything, but it just seemed like a lost opportunity. Tourism is a big part of this region. We are struggling to try to regroup in some ways since our Manchester Chamber left. The Burlington folks have come up. There's the Manchester Business Association that's growing. They're working together. There's the other young professional groups. The way we advertise is all changing all the time, but as a state, this should be a priority focus. And I'm not sure it is right now, but I think it should be a priority.
Representative Browning.
Thank you. I think this is a really important topic because so many people, in fact, do come and visit Vermont and then they come back and become Vermonters. So trying to be sure that people come and find out what Vermont has to offer is essential. I was at a meeting of legislators from all over the country that was held at the Equinox Hotel, and this was in late October. It wasn't even peak color, but it was still beautiful, and they were stunned by what we have to offer. They had never been here. They had no idea. So when people come here and they see the beauty, they see the natural resources, they see the vibrant communities, the arts, the sports opportunities, they will come back. But we have to get them to come for the first time. I hesitate to advocate spending more on something because, as Representative Keefe says, that means either you raise more money or you have to reduce spending on something else. I think the essential thing is that what we spend gives us bang for the buck, that we have an evidence-based analysis that tells us this is going to work, or as far as we can tell, this is going to work. You just don't want to throw money at ads if they're not targeting, if they're not using the community of online social media. So we really have to get smart because we won't always have more money. The last thing I think is that we need to remember that so much of what the state government does is invest in natural resources and in communities that help make Vermont an attractive place to come. So it's not as if the tourism advertising budget is the only way in which we support tourism. And lastly, I agree that the demise of Vermont Life was really astonishing to me. There should have been a way to keep it going online, to have someone else take it over. Definitely things rise and fall and things evolve, but I think there was a community of subscribers and of people with interest in Vermont, and I don't know that anybody is picking that up, and I think that's a tragedy.
Kathleen James.
People come to Vermont because we have a beautiful environment and because we offer amazing opportunities for outdoor recreation. And I understand that tourism is the absolute backbone of our economy, and the backbone of tourism is our environment. And so we need to protect it. So when I see that beaches are closed up on Lake Champlain and Lake Carmi because of blue-green algae, and when I think about climate change and how that's going to impact our skiing industry, I guess I would rather see us investing in taking aggressive action on climate change and cleaning up our waterways and protecting the environment we do have so that people will continue to find Vermont to be a beautiful place to visit and to move. I was kind of blown away. Actually, I was reading Ski Magazine last night because I do that for work. And the Aspen Snowmass Company had taken out a 2-page spread urging every skier and snowboarder in America to join the fight against climate change and to make it a defining issue on the ballot in November. Aspen's parent company is Alterra. Alterra owns 29 ski resorts plus Stratton. So I guess my response isn't necessarily that we should be increasing what we're spending on tourism marketing, but that we should be investing critical resources in protecting and conserving the environment that we have.
Okay, Representative Sullivan.
So Vermont, of course, thrives on tourism. One of the plans came through Commerce, the request for some money for tourism. The issue that we found was that they really didn't have a pure business plan to tell us exactly what was going on. So there were many questions, and the amount of money that was suggested was lowered than what was requested, and then it went on to appropriations for them to make their decision. Can we identify where we can cut? Yes, I think we can cut money. However, do we want to put that money into this advertising and tourism as opposed to some of the other programs and areas that we were just speaking about as panel? I know that, there are a lot of top-heavy attorneys in a lot of the agencies, and we can minimize some of those. We can cross-train on principals and executive assistants. So there are ways to minimize some money. The key is the advertising and tourism program the place that you want to put the savings that you actually can find? So I do believe we want tourism here, we want advertising, but I think we need a sensible business plan presented to us first.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, now it's time to get to your questions. And we've got several here. Some of them I'm going to combine just to kind of get as many in as possible. And I guess I'm just going to throw these questions out to the entire panel. Whoever wants to put their hand up first and take a crack at it goes first. Everyone will have an opportunity to weigh in. And we'll start off with this one. Oh, thank you. As if I don't have enough already. If a living wage law is passed in Vermont, would you support tax breaks to incentivize companies to come to or remain in Vermont? Another question, which is sort of on its face not related to it, but strikes me as something that you might want to mention in the course of your answer is, everyone is taking care of the employee. Who is taking care of the employer? Who wants to go first?
Wait, I just want to, so this is two questions, really.
If a living wage law is passed in Vermont, would you support tax breaks to incentivize companies to come to or remain in Vermont? Everyone is taking care of the employee. Who is taking care of the employer?
I guess I'll give it a shot. The problem with this question, because I think this is a really, really important topic, both in terms of the living wage question and the question of the employer and the businesses, because what it makes clear is that the way that you get a livable wage is when Vermont businesses can earn enough revenue and prosper so that they can cover that cost, when their employees are productive enough so that they can pay them more. And then they may benefit from a greater longevity, people staying, reduced training costs, and other kinds of things. But this relationship between employer and employee is really complicated, and I think it's best when the interests of the business owner and the worker are aligned together so that they make more together. When the business makes more revenue, the workers get more pay. And I think that one problem with some of our approaches sometimes is to require businesses to pay more without giving them a way to necessarily earn more. And that can really create problems because sometimes employees earn less, get less hours, or the businesses might substitute to use machines instead of workers. So as an economist, there are many problems with our market-based systems, but you don't usually want to solve them by intervening in the market. So to have a livable wage, most of the definitions I've seen are like $40,000 or $44,000 for families, and I just don't see how the Vermont business that I know can pay that much because they can't earn enough to cover it. So I think we need to support Vermont businesses. I think one of the best ways is with tax reform, which simplifies and clarifies the tax codes, removes unnecessary deductions and exemptions, and then you can lower all the rates. My understanding is that what businesses need more than anything else is low and stable tax rates. Now, the tax rates have to be high enough to cover the revenue that the state needs, but you don't want to be always moving things around like this. So just talk about using tax incentives to reward companies that pay a livable wage. That's certainly something that could be looked at, but right now, one of the problems that I see is I believe we are giving subsidies to companies that have really high multiples between what they pay their top executive and what they pay their workers, and other kinds of incentives to companies that don't necessarily do what we would like to see. So I think this whole area needs to be looked at, and I couldn't commit to either voting for a livable wage law or voting for incentives for businesses without understanding who's going to be helped, who's going to be hurt, and how is this going to work. And I'm sorry if that's not a satisfactory question. That's the best I can do.
All right. Anyone else want to jump into this one before we move on to the next question?
So when you, so first of all, definitions are important. When you talk, a livable wage is actually a defined term in state government. The Joint Fiscal Office defines it every year, and right now, Cynthia put it on an annual basis, but it's about $20 an hour, depending on the family size, et cetera. And every year, the Joint Fiscal looks at that. So when you see livable wage on campaign materials, it's way beyond the minimum wage of ideas that would raise the minimum wage to $15. Livable wage is a much higher threshold. So when you talk about using tax breaks to pay for companies that pay livable wages, you're talking about basically subsidizing those companies, and I think that's kind of I think a better way to do it is through the earned income tax credit within the tax code, as Cynthia's talking about. And we adjusted that this year because then it's a tax credit to people who are actually working. One of the problems with trying to solve poverty through the minimum wage is half the people that are living at or near poverty don't earn a wage. A lot of them are retirees living at lower income. They actually get hurt by a minimum wage because the inflationary impacts of the minimum wage on the economy hurt some people like retirees who'd have nothing to gain by the minimum wage going up. Another problem with the minimum wage, I served on the summer study committee. I was appointed by the speaker to that largely because of the work I did on the benefits cliff legislation. And we found that a lot of families that have kids that have child care subsidies would lose. There were about 7,000 families that would lose a net of about $12 million because of this benefit cliff phenomenon. I mean, that alone is enough reason to oppose this thing. But I think there's better ways to raise people's livelihood in this state, and one of them, for example, was we raised even in a climate of of keeping taxes low, we were able to send more money to home health service agencies, and those folks were able to pass that on to home health workers, and those sorts of things where we can help the businesses that are helping those in most need. Those are the ways we need to do this in a more targeted way rather than some of the other ideas out there.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in, or we can go to another question? Linda?
I just have one thing I'd like to say. The earned income tax credit, I know that has always been the choice and what I've been hearing over the minimum wage, but there's also a weakness to the earned income tax credit. It's not the total savior that everybody believes it is. If it were possibly a subsidy where it was spread out over time so that somebody did not get it just in one lump sum, it would be more suitable and it wouldn't harm employers as much. I think think that what we also need to understand is that businesses come here and they take on a fiduciary responsibility to give back to society. So who does take care of them is actually the employers, their businesses. So that's kind of the bargain that goes with it. Of course, we don't want to harm them, but I think the premise of opening up your own business says, I am going to participate in society, I am going to give back. So I think we should not say that, the minimum wage is the only thing that's bad and the earned income tax credit is the only thing that's good. There are pros and cons to both, and I think we need to assess them appropriately.
I can chime in a little bit. Yeah, assuming that we're talking about the minimum wage, I do understand, as Brian explained, that the livable wage is a much higher and different thing. I think that the earned income tax credit and adjusting the benefit cliff are really good ideas and good steps to take. I think they're very important. Like Linda, I really don't think it should be an either or. I think it's a yes and. I think it's very important that we take gradual steps to raise the minimum wage here. I talked earlier in the day about my commitment to equity. And if you look at American wages, the purchasing power of your average American working family has not budged in 40 years. So unemployment may be dropping and people may have jobs, but they cannot make ends meet on the jobs they have because their purchasing power is equivalent to what it was in the 70s. So I've, done quite a bit of reading on the minimum wage. I'm not an expert, but I tried to read all sides. I do see the, concerns that if you raise the wage, that businesses will respond by laying off workers. I've seen those. I've seen that scholarship. I've also seen studies that say that businesses more typically respond by small incremental price increases, and that raising the minimum wage benefits businesses because employees are better able to take care of themselves. They can afford, do a better job of affording to meet their basic needs like food and housing and health care. They have to rely less on state programs to help them in those situations. And that businesses that are offering more competitive wages attract better employees and can retain them and have a more stable workplace. So that's what I think.
All right.
Sorry, I got to get better at the wrap-ups. I'll work on that.
All right. Okay, here's something a little different. What is your position on creating safe bicycling infrastructure in Bennington County so that we are a more attractive tourist destination, safer recreation community, and have more inclusive and healthier transportation options? Who wants to go first?
I have a quick answer. I'm a cyclist and have pretty much quit biking because it feels unsafe to bike on the roads here. There was a summer a couple of years ago when we had when there were a number of cycling deaths up north and around here, and it was horrific. And I know everything costs money. I know the question is always how to pay for it, but I really think we need a bike path here. I think it would be a huge tourist draw, and personally, I'd like to get back on my bike. So,
Representative Browning.
I would just like to say that one thing that I participated in when I was on the Bennington County Transportation Advisory Council is the development of maps that gave good bicycling routes, information about good bicycling routes in the county. I don't know what the status of that initiative is right now, but there definitely are places that are safer and less challenging, and we need to get the information about those loops where it really makes sense. I think the one thing the legislature has done is I believe we've passed laws that require safe passage, that require sharing the road. There are laws about how you're supposed to pass cyclists and horseback riders. You are not supposed to just like zoom right by. You are supposed to leave space. We are all sharing the roads, and we all have to abide by the rules of the roads. I think the answer to this is as we rebuild our infrastructure, as we do systematically over time, we need to accommodate other forms of transportation, including bicycling. Kathleen. This is very difficult because in some ways, some places the right-of-way for the roads is quite narrow, and how do you accommodate that extra road, but that extra space? But in some places we have done it, and I think that we need to continue to work on that. And it should be, there are programs in the state government about bicycling and pedestrian transportation, and we need to continue to work on making those kinds of facilities available. And I believe Manchester is going to be doing some kind of bike lane on the 1130 corridor. I could be wrong about that, but I believe that we are, as part of redoing that corridor, that's one thing they're going to incorporate. And I think that's the way we're going to have to do it.
Well, I'm going to agree with Kathleen and Cynthia that we need to put more focus on this. Several years ago, when I was asked to chair the Manchester 2020 visioning process, we came out with 4 suggestions, and one of them was to make Manchester a biking destination. And there have been groups meeting to try to accomplish this, both on a mountain biking level and a street biking level. It's hard to do because, you know, it costs money, the roads are narrow, they're windy, but clearly there's I think our culture is moving more towards a more mobile society outside of using cars. And so where we can encourage cars, like down on the 1130 corridor with the streetscape design down there, those are good things. And yeah, I support this wholeheartedly. I think all of Vermont, the places in Vermont that can really succeed here, really help their local economies.
Pretty much I agree. I think that as we go forward improving the infrastructure, we should include transportation for bikers, and we should watch out for horses. However, I think that we should pay attention because Vermont attracts bikers. We have people who bike ride who come here specifically to do that. And also we have people who use bikes, and if we have safer roads and safer pathways, they will use them to go to work. So I think that it's important. I also think it's important that I stay off the road because I cannot bike ride. But I definitely think that it's important that we pay attention to the safety there.
The benefit for commuting, Brian, I'm glad you pointed that out too.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions on cleaning up Lake Champlain and other waterways in Vermont. A couple of you touched upon this earlier, but I guess just to combine a couple of questions here around this. What is your feeling on how much money the state should be spending to clean up Lake Champlain and other lakes and waterways in Vermont that have been either polluted or are seeing algae blooms of one sort or another make them unusable?
Well, I'll start on that one since I was recently criticized in the press for lack of attentiveness to this. You know, I grew up in Franklin County and lived on the banks of the Lamoille River, and our family used to go to St. Albans Bay and swim in the waters that today are unswimmable because of these algae blooms and such. In fact, many people think that St. Albans Bay will never be swimmable, and that's a tragedy, and we need to pay attention to it. When I worked for Senator Jim Jeffords, he was elected to the Senate in 1989. I was his environmental LA, legislative assistant. He made this a priority. We had a field hearing with Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan in March of 1989. And that started a series of legislative events where under his leadership, he wrote this bill. I was a staff person. We got it through in the last day of that session in 1990, late in the night, through his shuttle diplomacy, we passed the Lake Champlain Special Designation Act that set in place all of most of the structures, a lot of them, they change over time because it's been a lot of years, to have the cooperation between and among the state and federal and international agencies. And I've been very attentive to that operation ever since. So meanwhile, here we are back in the legislature, and we did have a vote on funding of Lake Champlain. And there are a couple different, and it's all about the money. So, and just to put people at ease, in the budget we passed this year, with very little tax increase and with spending kept at 2%, we fully funded every single initiative that's in the Lake Champlain plan as it is right now. What we're talking about with this vote that we cast was future initiatives that are yet ill-defined and yet prioritized. And so it's another case of the legislature that wants to tax in advance of really what they want to spend it on. And in this case, after abandoning a real estate property tax fee by fee across the state, that was the first idea, and it was, the town clerks were in an uproar because administratively crazy. Then they came back to a rooms and meals tax. A rooms and meals tax. Now, a lot of the impact of Lake Champlain, of course, is up north. A lot of it is these farming communities, and I love farmers, but a lot of it is up there. They were going to take about $12 or $14 million out of our economy and send it up to their economy. I'm sorry, our economy sending to their economy $14 million a year. Quick geographic lesson. We are not in the Lake Champlain Basin. We are in the Battenkill Watershed Basin. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be attentive to Lake Champlain. It's a state jewel. It's a jewel of Vermont. We need to be attentive to it. But this year we funded every single initiative that should have been funded. We increased funding in bonding, and it was unnecessary to raise a rooms and meals tax on the businesses in Manchester to send it north. We're not ready for that. It was too much, and we shouldn't have to do that.
Representative Browning.
I think that eventually, I think we probably will need new sources of revenue to fund the cleanup that's necessary. I was instrumental in defeating the rooms and meals tax that was proposed as a kind of backup source of funding. I myself am trying to look at ways that we could use taxes and fees on polluting activities and polluting materials, because in that way you could raise revenue. The people using those materials could economize and reduce their use of those materials, so they would have less pollution and you would have money to do the cleanup. We need to prevent pollution and we need to raise money to clean up the pollution. One of the things that I, again, have to emphasize is how much of state government is at cross purposes. We don't have enough enforcement of existing regulation. For decades, farmers who were in the current use program, which means they get a deduction on their property taxes because they're farming their land, did not have to abide by acceptable management practices, which means not polluting the rivers and streams and lakes. There was no enforcement. So here we're paying, we are all paying, all property taxes, we're paying to give them a property tax reduction, and they were not required to take care of the state's waterways. So I pointed that out, and that is now changed. I also pushed through a change that would mean that you can't get a state grant unless you're in good standing in terms of all pollution regulations. You can't get a state grant if you are in violation of some air or water quality permit requirement. So I think that's one of the things we need. We will need more money, and I don't have a magic source, although I think requiring the people that are doing the pollution to reduce their pollution or to pay to clean up the pollution is much better than taxing rooms and meals who are not creating the pollution. So I don't have a magic answer to what we will have to do. I think we will need more in the future, but right now the projects are coming. It takes a while to even get the projects engineered. They're still in the pipeline, and I think we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. But the most important thing is that we not have provisions in state government that are actually subsidizing activities that are causing pollution. That's why we have these problems that we never solve. And that's what I've identified, and that's what I'm working to try to straighten out for you.
The Vermont Treasurer Beth Pierce this spring issued an urgent call to action on Lake Champlain. She said it was a crisis. She said it was time to stop studying the issue, that we had done enough studies, and that it was time to take immediate action. Her main point, and I reread her op-ed just a couple days ago, is that it's going to hurt the Vermont economy in the long run and cost more later if we keep kicking the can down the road. So she recommended reallocating some existing dollars. She did talk about raising new revenues, maybe through an impervious surface fee. And I do agree that we're going to have to take a look at some hard solutions, maybe taking a look at some large-scale dairy farming, because I know that they're contributors to the pollution problem with runoff and phosphorus and stuff. So anyway, I guess I don't see this as an up north problem. I don't think we can afford to be parochial about this. I think that Lake Champlain is a source of drinking water. It's a key source of tourism. It is, as Brian said, a jewel. And I think we need to act now, and I think we need to find a fair way to pay for it now, not later.
So pretty much I believe we've heard pretty much all of the answers here. I do think it's important that we look at the cause and who has caused it and go there as well for some of the monies back. I believe it's important that Vermonters remain confident that their water is going to be clean and toxic-free. I do think, as Representative Browning said, lack of enforcement of existing regulation is a big deterrent, and that we need to focus on that. As far as availability of funds and revenues, we need to look at what the cause was and go there.
Okay, last question. Everyone heaves a big sigh of relief. And again, this is going to be a sort of a combination of a couple of questions, but they all sort of deal with the same issue. And how are we, and this is one that's certainly an issue here in Manchester and our part of Bennington County, going to be able to come up with a way to develop more workforce housing for people who are having a hard time finding an apartment that they can afford to rent or a house they can afford to buy. I'm going to have to be really strict on you all on this one. I realize this is an incredibly complicated question that is difficult to answer in a minute or two, but that's what you got. So how should we go forward on workforce housing?
I can go quick. I know that Manchester's already taking some steps, I think, to address this, really positive steps. We've changed our zoning laws to allow greater density in the core, in the downtown business core, which I think is a great idea. I think we've also changed the zoning laws to allow the conversion of existing properties like in at Willow Pond to apartments. And I think these are small steps that are going to make a big difference. And it's smart growth, too, because people who live in these houses or live in these places near downtown and in these affordable apartments can walk or bike to work. So
in order to have more workforce housing, either we have to directly increase supply through public or private action, or we have to provide more finances to the people who are trying to obtain it. And we may need to do both. I would go back to the question of straightening out the cost of property taxes in terms of affordable apartments. I think that's key. I think we've had a first-time home buyer program that we funded, and it's a revolving loan fund, and we provide grants to first-time home buyers, because remember, the hardest part is getting that first home, and that's a very small program, but it can really make a difference. I think the conversion and reuse of vacant properties, whether it's retail space or lodging, is really, really important, and if there are ways that the state can support that with planning, I think that's really, really good. But the other issues in terms of how we enable employees to earn more and be more productive so they can fully participate in the economy are really crucial. But I think there are things we can do that will make a difference around the edges.
I'd like to take the opportunity to agree 100% with Kathleen on the Manchester zoning and bylaw rules, and I think you explained it very well. I think that's a key for Manchester. Doesn't do much for the rest of the district per se, and one thing I'll just repeat, we did last year was we raised this past session, we raised the property taxes on those very workforce housing, I think unnecessarily, and I hope we can avoid doing that in the future, because taxes are a big cost of the housing, and affordability is cost.
My turn?
Sorry, Lynn.
No, it's okay. I think that affordable housing, no matter what you call it, whether you call it subsidized housing, workforce housing, affordable housing, is dangerously close to becoming extinct. I think that one solution might be to modify some zoning permits to look at small lots and see if you can't change that to put a multiple home on there, or a second home, perhaps a guest home, and work with some tax incentives or lack of property tax on the second home if somebody actually rents out their second home or guest home to a worker or to somebody who needs it at a very low income.
Okay. Well, unlike the way I started off this evening, by blithely forgetting completely about offering them a chance to make an opening statement, I did not forget that we're going to close things up tonight with a closing statement from each one of the candidates. We have a few minutes left, so if each one of you would like to make a closing statement to finish off the evening, and then we'll call it a night.
Another order then?
Well, let's see. Why don't we start with you, Representative Browning, as the most senior representative on at the table. And I mean that in a good way.
I actually think it's a good thing because I've been there, I've been in the legislature, I have relationships, I have built up a store of knowledge, and I've built the ability to think creatively about our problems and how to solve them. And I hope that at least some of my answers tonight have gone some distance to showing you that. I think you can see that among the candidates here, we share a lot in terms of our values and our policy goals. The question is, which candidate is going to really be good at making sure the policies put in place actually achieve those goals? And I think I have skills to offer that can contribute to that achievement. I think that the fact that I'm an economist and an environmentalist are really important. Right now we have a time of change and uncertainty in Washington in terms of fiscal policy and also in terms of environmental policy and some destructive changes there. It's essential that Vermont policies be based on reality, not slogans, and that they are designed so that they will really work for Vermonters without unintended consequences. And I think I have the analytical skills, the communication skills, and the relationships to contribute towards achieving that goal. You have 2 votes. There are 2 seats in this district. I ask you for one of your 2 votes.
Kathleen James.
So I wanted to close by just talking briefly about what I can promise you if you vote for me on November 6th. The main thing I can promise you is that I will have an open mind. I will respect your opinions and ideas. I will listen to you, and I will value your experience, and I will seek out your opinion. I've spent most of my career working as a professional journalist. I think that these skills translate extremely well to the legislature. When I am assigned anything, whether it's writing a story or understanding a policy issue, I start out by conducting my own research. I find all my own sources. Then I talk to people because I think it's very, very important to get people's personal perspective on how policy has worked or how things impact their lives. And then I read everything carefully, and I come up with what I hope is an objective conclusion. And I think that those are skills that will translate extremely well to Montpelier. I also value communication very much. And in all my campaign materials, and I know it's a message I've been hammering hard just because it's so central to who I am, I think it's really important that I bring information to you, that you don't have to come to me to seek it out. So if I'm elected, I promise that I will hold town meetings or office hours in all 4 towns around our district. I promise to send an e-newsletter. Jeff Wilson is really a role model of mine, and Steve Berry. These are representatives that used to do a really fantastic job of putting articles in the Manchester Journal all the time. So I'd like to see if we could work with the Journal to set up some regular legislative column. Maybe we take turns contributing so that, you know, one person from one party isn't writing all the time, but I think there should be an article in the Journal every week during the session if possible. I'll send out an e-newsletter and solicit your feedback back. And like I know everyone at this table does, I of course will respond to your questions and concerns in a timely manner. I'll also work hard. It's really difficult to describe how hard I worked to try to get ready for this debate tonight. And I hope I did a good job. And I did that as a measure of respect for you. Because if you're going to consider voting for me, you need to know that I respect the job, that I respect the issues, that I will do whatever it takes to do a good job for you, and that I take it seriously. So believe me, this is just the summary binder. So I'm running because I really care about this community. I've lived here a long time. When I look out at this audience tonight and I know almost everyone, it makes me think that I'm doing the right thing. Thanks.
Moderator Sullivan.
So first, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out, and I'd like to thank you for letting me be up here, even though I am not in a live race. I have, since the inception of my tenure, gone out and always held meetings in all of my districts. I tap into the resources of my voters. But more importantly, right now, it's not about me. You have three very important, wonderful candidates here running in a district, and you have 2 votes. I ask that you use those votes. Go for your candidates of your choice, but stay engaged, because your 2 votes will send the people that you want up to Montpelier, and that's very important. Thank you.
Brian.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you to GNAT, the folks at home, folks in the audience, the Bennington and Rutland County committees that the Bennington Republican Democrat committees that have sponsored this. It's been a great discussion, touched on some great issues. I would appreciate your support to go back up there. I've tried tonight to be as direct and honest and thorough on all of these questions. I don't have a binder in front of me, but I feel I have a lifetime of preparation to know these issues, to use my best judgment to do what's in best interest of this district on each and every time. I ran 2 years ago because we'd gone through 6 years of raising taxes and raising spending, and I felt frustrated, and I had friends who felt frustrated, and I know a lot of people were frustrated by that. And over the past 2 years, we've pretty much held taxes steady, with the exception of some of the things we talked about tonight, and increased our budget by 2% only. Meanwhile, we increased spending on child care, we increased spending on affordable housing, we increased spending on Lake Champlain cleanups, fully funding everything that Treasurer Pierce wanted, stipulated in her study, and we funded other priorities as well. We can do a better job up there, and it's best with a balanced government. We proved that the last 2 years. Having balance in Montpelier provides much better service to constituents, because it's not one side ruling the day. You have 2 parties, and they hash things out, they discuss things on their merits, and they make the best decisions. So thank you for this discussion. I'm happy to answer any questions anytime. I have a piece on my Facebook page about the why I'm running thing, as I'm sure we all do, and I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with all of you. Thank you.
Andrew, I just need to correct something. We already have a system in which we write a column in the Manchester Journal alternating weeks. That system has been in place for a long time. So we've all been writing columns in that on a rotating basis for a number of years. So you were proposing that, but I just want everybody to know we've been doing that all along, and Brian and I and Representative Sullivan have been participating in that.
Okay. Well, that wraps up for tonight. Thank you all for coming out. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. Thank you to all the candidates for such a great job. And thank you to the sponsors and everyone else who was involved in making tonight's event happen.